Hi, my name is Rehgan Avon, and I am the CEO and founder of Women in Analytics. WIA is a community-based organization that promotes visibility to women in the analytics space. The session you're about to see is a fireside chat between Falon and Berit. Falon comes from the VC world. She is a partner at Narya Capital, and Berit is the Chief Product Officer at Sisu. And Berit kind of dives into her passion in product and startups and how she applies that to the really big opportunity that Sisu is trying to tackle today, which is finding insights from a large amount of data. She kind of dives into her journey, finding her way to Sisu, and how she took her passion for product and applied that in the analytics space. Thank you so much, Berit, for coming to the Women in Analytics Conference, and we look forward to viewing the session.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
My name is Falon Donohue. I'm from Columbus, so I live here. I'm a partner with Narya Capital, and we invest in early-stage life science and technology companies. And Berit is joining us from San Francisco, so thanks so much for making the trip. We're excited to have you.
Absolutely excited to be here, and thanks everyone for joining.
So in your journey so far, you went to Stanford and Yale, you spent some time at large companies, you spent some time at startup companies. Would love just to hear a little bit more about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have, as you said, kind of a long journey, but I've actually been in product pretty much my whole career and consistently been focused on kind of enterprise or B2B products. Somewhat recently got into kind of the analytics world after leaving Google. I found the startup Sisu, and excited to talk a little bit about that journey. But yeah, I think I've kind of continually in my career been drawn towards earlier stage companies, kind of that, what I think is a really fun journey of both building the company and building the product and kind of figuring out, experiencing all the highs and lows of that, and ended up at Google by way of acquisition, and got to Sisu because I was just ready to get back to the early stage of, like I said, building.
Awesome. Well, maybe talk to us more a little bit about Sisu, what you guys do, and what your role is as a Chief Product Officer.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sisu Data, we're a Series B company, about 60 or 70 people, and at a high level, I think the opportunity that we see in the market, or really, I guess, the problem that we're trying to solve is, helping shape and hopefully helping define how data-driven decision-making needs to evolve in this world where, not just the volume of data has exploded, but the dimensionality of that data has exploded. So you look at kind of what cloud data infrastructure has done to the data that companies have. It's much easier to capture data, to transfer it, to get it into cloud data warehouse. It's a lot cheaper and easier to store it. And so companies have invested in getting such a wealth of data that with the hope of actually being able to extract valuable insights from it. And our kind of observation is that, well, we've seen a lot of evolution in kind of the infrastructure to extract, move, store that data. The kind of final layer, the value extraction, hasn't fundamentally changed, or is I think due for some really big disruption in terms of how we actually, like I said, find insights in that data. And so that's really the problem that we're trying to solve at Sisu. And we have actually came out of, our founder was doing research at Stanford and kind of studying scalable ML and actually working with some companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft in doing that. And so he's kind of a academic background, but I think was enjoying actually the process of getting into these companies and seeing a lot of the challenges that even these massive companies were facing in terms of there's so much data. Where do I even focus? Where should my attention go in the first place to be able to actually get value out of that data? And so where we've started is really focusing on helping companies, kind of answer the why questions in their data. So traditional kind of existing BI does a pretty good job of helping people answer kind of what questions, what happened to my metric? Did it go up, did it go down? But so often the next question is, well, why did that happen? And so that's where we've built a proprietary engine that is able to look at every dimension and every subpopulation and combination of those subpopulations in the data and pull out the ones that actually had statistically significant impact on the metric that you care about. And it's obviously early in our journey. I think you also asked about what's my role been in kind of creating and guiding Sisu's journey thus far. I mentioned that our CEO and founder was an academic background. So I would say my role has been trying to, kind of come in and think about how do we take and harness what is a really powerful engine and technical capability, but translate that into a product experience that's approachable, that is intuitive, understandable. So that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half or 2 years.
Awesome. And you went from Google to a startup. That's obviously worlds apart. So maybe talk a little bit about how those compare, large company versus a small company, and what do you prefer?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely worlds apart. I think that probably there's a couple things that stand out to me as, I guess I should start by saying probably my preference is earlier stage. Okay. That's kind of what has kept me coming back to, I was at a startup that got acquired by Google and then decided to obviously come back to that. So I think the things that really stick out to me as different and that I really gravitate towards, one is just kind of the opportunity for impact, which probably sounds a little counterintuitive, because you think of a company like Google or these big tech companies that have just huge reach, and in some sense, actually, the opportunity for impact there is unmatched, right? Because you've got a brand and a customer base that's beyond what any startup could even imagine. But I think what really struck me was that there was no world in which any of the decisions that I made at Google were going to fundamentally impact whether the company succeeded.
Sure.
It had already succeeded, right? And it can actually absorb failure in a way that that I think startups can't. So, I think one of the biggest differences is kind of the pressure and meaning and impact on the company of the decisions you're making. Every single person at a startup is making daily decisions that are going to impact whether or not the company succeeds. Yeah. And that's just a level of, of pressure and meaning that I find really energizing on a day-to-day basis. And I think the other thing that's probably obvious is just the speed at which you can move. Yeah. There's an opportunity to just, you can put things out there and experiment and try things that when you've got a massive company and brand to protect and uphold, you just can't do that.
Right. And resources at Google are nearly bottomless, and sometimes that can stifle creativity.
Absolutely.
You have no money, you have no choice but to get creative sometimes.
Absolutely.
What about the challenges of growing a startup company?
Yes, there are plenty. I think it's a cliche, but people will really, talk about. It's a cliche, but people talk about. I do really believe startups are kind of the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. So you can go from thinking one day you're literally going to change the world and have this huge impact to the next day, which is like, what am I doing? And I'm just wasting my time here. So I think some of it is just kind of managing and how do you actually temper on both sides of that. And that comes, I guess, with kind of experience and having seen it a little bit and kind of knowing, okay, it's really low right now, it's going to feel better, or this feels amazing, we're going to have a huge challenge coming soon. The other kind of big lesson, I guess, for me has been that, well, a lot of the, I kind of compare over the past couple of years as we've grown. I joined Sisu very early, and we've been going through a lot of growth and continue to be growing as a company. Similarly, Bebop, the company I was at before, so joined at similar stages and actually see a lot of the same types of challenges and problems. But I think what's really sticking out in my mind is what worked with one team and one company does not always work. For the same problem, the same scenario, but it's a different company, it's a different set of people. And so really needing to kind of tailor the solution to any problem to kind of what is unique about the team and kind of the situation that we're in. And I think maybe one other thing I'll just say is particularly on the kind of building product side, there's obviously a journey and ups and downs you go through with actually getting the product experience right. I think there's also a journey you go through with figuring out as a team, how do we build product? And that has been something that I don't think there's a shortcut. I think you just kind of have to go through we did a pretty big rebuild in my first 9 months at Sisu and fundamentally redesigned the product. And, it, of course, took longer than we all hoped it would. And I just don't think there's a shortcut to that because part of what we're doing is we're building the muscle. How do we disagree? How do we actually learn from maybe some of the wrong decisions? How do we just collaborate and communicate with each other? And doing that all in the context of remote work and COVID, I think has been especially interesting.
Do you think that the startup life is particularly suited for a type of personality?
It's a great question. I think I would say there are some characteristics that I think are going to make it more people who have those characteristics are just going to find it more enjoyable. One of those is, I like to say when I'm interviewing people to join the team, I'm looking for not just can they navigate ambiguity, but do they thrive in ambiguity? Because you have so many open-ended questions and just kind of big spaces to figure out as a startup. And there are some people who can manage that and get through it, but it's exhausting for them, right? And that's just not going to be fun. I think the people that I found who really thrive in a startup environment are the people who see that as not, whoa, this is overwhelming, but this is cool. I can take this in whatever direction I want, and there's all this messiness and tough, crazy, weird stuff that I get to dive in and help figure that out. So that needs to be energizing. And I think the other thing I would say is that maybe two other characteristics. One is enjoying working under pressure. We talked a little bit about that at the beginning, and just the decisions you make matter. And then the third is being comfortable failing, because there's a lot of failure.
I want to take a quick pause just to check in with you guys and see if anyone has any questions for Berit. I don't know. Should I bring the mic? Or not? The logistics. The question was, can you talk a little bit more about your trajectory to the C-level in product?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I kind of I mentioned I've been in product pretty much my whole career, and very much started, actually, this is, I'll say, not something I shared openly early in my career, but I actually was a history and econ major, which is not typical for product people, and that's something I hid quite a bit, especially being in Silicon Valley. But I think it's important to say now, because I actually think one thing I take from that is, and one thing I really believe, is that there's not one archetype of product person. I think, product is about, at the end of the day, like fundamentally understanding your users and your customers, and then hopefully being able to kind of bring people together, put together a framework for how do we think about what problem we're solving and how to move forward. And that doesn't necessarily require a CS degree. So I share that a little bit because I think my start in product was non-traditional, and candidly, I was lucky that someone was willing to take a risk on me, and I kind of learned on the job. So started out kind of obviously just as an individual contributor, product manager for quite a while, and I think slowly started to kind of, I got the advice, and I think it's really good advice that someone gave me, which was, if you want to grow as an individual, join a growing company. And so I would say my kind of transition into leadership really happened at Bebop, and that was, so a startup that was kind of going through a lot of growth. And one thing I'll add is that it did not start with someone saying, why don't you lead the product team? It started with, kind of, I think, me seeing a gap in how we were operating, and we were a bunch of individual PMs, not always thinking about how things came together. And so trying to just step in and fill that gap a little bit, and probably for longer than I wanted, not having that officially recognized. But in hindsight, I'm really thankful to the person who was kind of overseeing and leading our group for not giving me that explicit title, because it forced me to figure out how to have more of that like influence without authority, which I think is so critical in product. And so anyway, I don't know if that's like answering exactly your question, but yeah, I would say it's particularly in product, which tends to be a pretty flat function. It doesn't always come with being handed like the title. I think it comes a lot with seeing a gap, stepping into it, and then, growing with the team and growing with the product.
Any other questions?
Hi. So being a product manager at a startup, I imagine you get VC funding. So do you get direction from the funders themselves, and how do you manage those expectations? Like, I'm sure the product team has a very specific set of ideas, and maybe the VCs have a completely different set. So how do you manage that, and what are the approaches you've taken with the products you've developed?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and yes. So I'll talk a little bit actually about Sisu, where I think I've had the most interaction with the board. So a couple things. Our board is pretty small, but it's got some, so Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz is on our board, and then Pete Sansini from NEA. So two, pretty well-known investors. And I mention that only because I think, well, it's a small board. It's on some levels, an intimidating board. And I actually, when joining Sisu, interviewed with Ben, which was definitely an intimidating experience. And I mention that because I think one of the most important things to remember when you think about the dynamics between investors and the people who are actually running the company and in their day-to-day is that we're in the company running it day-to-day, and the investors are not. And I say that not to say that there's not valuable insight and input. There absolutely is, and I think one of the most important contributions that investors bring is they can ask really thoughtful questions. They can identify patterns that they've seen across different companies and kind of push you to think about things. Again, identify, here's what I've seen before, are you thinking about that, maybe help you find blind spots. But I think it's really risky if you start letting the investors make decisions for you. I really view it as it's input that we need to take, we need to sit with, and we need to take very seriously, because at the end of the day, obviously, there's an experience level there, and there's also a oversight, that as board members they're serving, but they're not living with the day-to-day consequences of some of those decisions. And so it's important to be able and willing to kind of, if you do have conviction in something, stand in that conviction. An example with Sisu is, I will say, when I kind of said we're going to redesign and rebuild this entire product, there was some skepticism, both from our CEO and from the board. That's a pretty significant undertaking, but it was something that I had really strong conviction in, that we needed to get a foundation we could build on. And so I take the kind of questions and challenge as, great, you're helping make my thinking better, because I either need to have answers, really solid answers to your questions, or maybe I need to adjust some things. But it's not, let me take your question and let that steer me in a completely different way.
Any other questions? We've got a lot of questions.
Hi, you said one of the qualities or traits for a person to work in a startup is being comfortable failing. And you also said something about living with the consequences, right? So how do you create a culture or an environment where people feel that comfort when they fail?
Yes. So that's a great question, and my short answer is it's not easy, right? And I think it's something that takes a lot of intentionality. One thing that I've found to be really important is, so I think maybe a way that maybe is not a good way to encourage or create an environment for failure is to make it a place where it's a lot of kind of just individual opinions, and that's what guides decisions about like where to make investments or where to place bets. Because if that's how you let some of the failure happen, it's just this idea, this idea, this idea, that's so disorienting. And I think the things that, probably one of the most important things at a product, at an early stage startup, is alignment and shared understanding of where we're headed. So it definitely should not come from, hey, this is just anyone gets to throw out an idea and we throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. The way that I like to kind of frame it and talk to people about it is, we're making educated, informed bets that have to be grounded in insights about our customers and our users. So that has to be grounded and backed up with, what user research did we do to give us conviction in this direction? What are we hearing from customers that, that make us believe this is the right path to go? So there's, comfort with failure should not come with lack of rigor in decision making. But I think what I do try to do then is say, we don't expect every bet to work out, right? And kind of saying that up front. And I think if you combine the mindset up front of some of the things we do will fail, part of our job and part of my job as a product person is to help us figure out those bets and align on what bets make sense to make as quickly as possible so we can get them in the market, and then customers tell us why we were wrong. Because that's really what we have to ground success or failure. It's not in, was it a good idea and did we debate it, what I call like ivory tower product design. It's got to be grounded in getting things in the hands of customers and users, and they're our barometer for whether or not we succeeded or failed.
What other questions you guys have?
Thank you. I like your look, by the way. I know you mentioned that the ability to thrive under ambiguity and a lot of pressure is a good quality to have, and I imagine working at many startups, you develop that and you learn if it's where you want to be. What are some things that folks having worked at zero or just one startup before, can bring to the table that can be an asset as well?
Can you say the end of that? Just, you said folks at kind of their first startup, and then I didn't hear the rest.
Yep. What are some other strengths that folks working at their first startup or second, only a little bit of experience, what else can they bring to the table that maybe they don't have those battle-hardened skills yet?
Yes.
Or what can they do?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I'll actually maybe carry forward one of the things I was just talking about, which is that hyper-focus and almost obsession with customers and users. That's something that I think it doesn't take having seen the movie 17 times to be able to just say, anytime you hear maybe a decision or a conversation going in a direction that is a lot of people saying, I think we should do this, I think that we should do this, it's a great time to say, have we tested this? Have we gone and talked to users? Have we gone and talked to our customers? And kind of be that steady drumbeat of how we make decisions and is grounded in what we know about users and customers. Because I think when that doesn't happen, that's when startups get on a really long path of doing the wrong things. And again, there's going to be failure, but the faster you get through that, it's almost like the faster you fail, the more successful you're going to be in the long run. And a great way to speed up that process is getting things in front of customers. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I think another thing is just, maybe before, or I guess as you join, or potentially before you join a startup, just having some conviction about why you're doing that. One thing that I've done and gotten advice on, which I thought was really also great advice, when you join a company, write yourself a letter about why you're joining it, and maybe periodically come back and look at it. You're never going to have more conviction than at the moment you make that decision. And so I'm sharing this as maybe a potential way to help navigate the ups and downs, even if it's not like, oh, I've seen these, I've experienced these before. If you personally have that kind of foundation to come back to, here's what I saw, here's the opportunity, here's why I have conviction, and that's something that you can bring yourself back to when things are hard, I think that will also help you guide your peers in doing that too. Suggesting and reminding people, why did you join? Here's why I joined.
That's great advice. Any other questions? I can't see everyone. Oh. Poor guy.
You guys are keeping him busy, running back and forth.
Steps in.
Thank you for your time answering the questions. You mentioned, be comfortable failing and enjoy working under pressure. I took the note. I would like to hear your experience, if you can share how you influence without authority. Can you share a scenario where you have done that?
Yeah, and just, influence.
Without authority.
Without authority, yes. Yeah, many examples of that. Trying to think what is maybe the most poignant example to share. Okay, well, I'll actually go with, since I talk a little bit about this, well, actually, that might be, you could argue that I had authority to do that since I was leading product. I'll go back to actually working on a product while I was at Google before I was formally leading the team. And, I think So the scenario here was really, we were getting ready to launch a new product. And what I was trying to kind of influence and help guide people towards was like, what was the kind of MVP scope that we needed to hit in order to launch, which I think is always a very difficult, it's a difficult thing to define, right? Like, if you wait too long, you're slow to launch. If you go too early, you launch something that's bad and doesn't sit well with customers. And so I think one of the things that I did to try to establish, I guess, even the right, if you will, to help define that, was to try to find some areas where the way we were functioning as a team, where I could help improve that. So it's kind of a like show value to kind of create that seat at the table. And some of that honestly was very tactical stuff. It was, you know, just figuring out a framework and kind of, I guess, norms or best practices for how do we share information about how we're progressing on like the status of projects. How do we actually, you know, one of the things was we're kind of in this long march towards launch where it can feel like there's not a lot of milestones or celebrations along the way. One of the things I did was had people put basically the projects we were working on, put them on a piece of paper, put them all up on a wall, and then as people finish those projects or finish those features, they would actually go down, take the piece of paper off the wall and rip it to everyone. So it's kind of this like visceral celebration of like, we finished this, right? So it's a small thing, right? But I think it was a way to kind of help create a sense of progress and create a sense of just more visibility and communication. And I think by putting in place some of those, again, more tactical process-oriented things, it started to help establish, you know, that I was helping bring the team some value in how we were operating, which I think then helped establish some more credibility when it came to decisions about, are we ready to launch or not?
Cool. Any other questions?
You mentioned that as a product manager, how important it is to have an obsession with customer feedback. What methodologies or techniques did you use to get that feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. Short answer is it depends actually a lot on what is the question you're trying to answer or kind of what stage you're at. So broadly, there's you know, few kind of high-level categories, right? There's actually conducting user research, right? Putting together a specific study or research plan, and there's a bunch of different research methodologies. I subscribe to kind of human-centered design, and there's a lot of great, like I said, a lot of great literature out there if you look up human-centered design and kind of different user research methodologies for what type of research to do depending on what state you're at in the project, right? It can be everything from what I would call like needs finding, just going and talking to people, sitting and saying, tell me how you do this today. Show me what tools you use. Just, you know, kind of walk me through what works well and what's painful about how you do this today. That's kind of in that like discovery needs finding category. All the way to once you started to have, actually put kind of designs together and even have some concepts before you have high fidelity designs, but very lightweight prototypes, right? You can go and put that in front of people and say, it's just concept testing. Does the mental model resonate here? All the way to actually doing high fidelity usability testing, putting a you know, clickable, usable prototype in front of people, giving them a task and seeing if they're able to do it. So that's kind of the spectrum of different like user research methodologies, and there's so many that I didn't even mention. But that's one bucket, and I think that's something that making user research a core part, especially early, when you don't have a lot of, actually listening to customers becomes a lot easier when you have a lot of customers. right? Because you can actually just run the data and look at how people are using the product, and you've got kind of this wealth of people and data to actually inform your decision. I think the harder part is when you don't have that, and that's where I think user research becomes so critical. But then, of course, I think developing, in addition to those kind of qualitative research methodologies, the quantitative muscle to say, and actually investing in, that's something I'm, especially being an analytics product and kind of in the data-driven decision-making space, that's something that at Sisu we are really trying to, even from an early stage, really build that muscle of like every feature we ship has clearly defined success criteria, metrics that we're going to track. We get those actually instrumented and tracked, and then we revisit them. And so we have an explicit stage in our kind of product definition or project release process where after something, we do kind of what are called product review meetings ahead of releasing, where we're talking about what are the requirements and what are the designs. We have one that happens after release, right, where we say, come back and tell us, and let's talk about what worked, what didn't, how are we tracking on the success metrics, what can we learn from actual usage data, and actually using Sisu to do that. So kind of Sisu on Sisu being a big initiative. So I think those two, I guess my summary is that both the qualitative kind of user research as well as the quantitative, what I would call like usage metrics and usage analytics, I think are really, really critical. And then maybe the third bucket, which is not quite as formal as some of the user research that I talked about, but just finding the forums to just talk and interface with customers. Whether that's setting up a customer advisory program, or having a couple customers who actually opt in to be design partners, and you can kind of just use them as thought partners and bounce ideas off of them. Those are kind of three big areas that I would say, if you invest in all three of those areas, you're going to have really, I think, a solid understanding of who your customer is, and that's going to just help the product decisions you make.
Well, that is our time. Thank you so much. You've been the best audience ever. This is the easiest job I've ever had. And let's all thank Berit for making the trip and sharing all her wisdom with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.